a diplomatic collapse that unfolded not over months or weeks, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shattered what remained of diplomatic trust between Moscow and Washington, 72 hours that exposed the depth of Russia's strategic desperation, 72 hours that triggered the most aggressive Ukrainian military response we've seen this year. What Russia did this week crossed a line that the White House had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a coordination that stunned even their own allies. For 3 weeks now, there had been whispers, not official statements, not formal intelligence briefings, just whispers, that Russia was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Kyiv this Monday was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the increased encrypted traffic between Moscow and field commanders, the repositioning of strategic assets near the Ukrainian border, the sudden rotation of diplomatic personnel out of neutral countries, the sudden cessation of all back-channel communications with Western intermediaries. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For weeks, NATO satellites had been tracking unusual troop concentrations in Belarus, just north of the Ukrainian border. But these weren't the standard rotations we'd grown accustomed to seeing. These were elite units, the kind Russia only deploys when they're planning something that requires absolute operational security. The pattern was there, the build-up was obvious, but the objective remained unclear. Until Wednesday morning, when everything became terrifyingly clear. Early Wednesday morning, Ukrainian air defense systems detected what they described as a coordinated missile barrage, including thermobaric weapons that had not been deployed in Ukrainian airspace in over 8 months. These are the kinds of weapons that Russia only uses when they are signaling something very specific, total disregard for international norms, willingness to escalate beyond conventional warfare, or deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure during what was supposed to be a humanitarian ceasefire. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing its entire strategic posture, and when a nuclear-armed state shifts its military posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The targets weren't military installations, they weren't ammunition depots, they weren't even the power grids that Russia had systematically targeted throughout the winter. They were hospitals, specifically 3 hospitals in Lviv, Kharkiv, and Kyiv that had been designated under international law as protected humanitarian sites, sites that Russia had explicitly agreed just 11 days earlier in Geneva would remain off-limits as part of a limited ceasefire agreement brokered by Switzerland and Turkey. Russia had signed that agreement. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had stood beside his Turkish counterpart and called it a meaningful step toward de-escalation. 11 days later, Russian Iskander missiles struck all 3 facilities within a 6-hour window. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a targeting error. This was deliberate, calculated, and designed to send a message. Agreements mean nothing. The statement issued by President Biden this afternoon was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior White House officials, after an emergency National Security Council meeting, described Russia's strike as a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law, a deliberate act of deception against mediators who negotiated in good faith, and perhaps most importantly, a strategic mistake that would be met with immediate and severe consequences, but warnings only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated and devastating we've seen in the entire 30-month conflict. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the hospital strikes, Ukraine launched Operation Steel Resolve. These weren't the standard artillery barrages or drone reconnaissance missions. These were deep strike operations using Western-supplied ATACMS missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and domestically produced long-range drones, systems that Ukraine only deploys when they're preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield calculus. The targets were not random. They were not symbolic. They were surgical strikes designed to cripple Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations in three critical sectors: Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. Tonight, Pentagon sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on 17 Russian military installations, including the Kerch Bridge logistics hub that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate those reinforcements. They hit ammunition storage facilities near Mariupol. They hit the Belbek air base in occupied Crimea. They hit command and control centers that were likely preparing to coordinate the next wave of attacks on Ukrainian cities. In other words, Ukraine targeted the logistical spine of Russia's offensive capability, the fuel depots that would have sustained armored advances, the communications infrastructure that would have made coordinated operations possible. This is what made Biden's warning so urgent. Russia's hospital strikes weren't just symbolic, they were preparatory. They represented the kind of terror campaign designed to break civilian morale before a major military push, and Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste munitions on empty buildings. They didn't target civilian areas in retaliation. They hit fuel depots that will take months to rebuild. They hit ammunition stockpiles that represented weeks of accumulated supplies. According to satellite imagery analyzed by independent military experts, Ukraine's strikes achieved what NATO planners call strategic disruption, the kind of damage that doesn't just destroy assets but forces the enemy to completely recalculate their operational timeline. One strike on a railway junction outside Jankoy, Crimea, destroyed what intelligence sources estimate was over 40 freight cars loaded with artillery shells and tank ammunition destined for Russian positions in Zaporizhia. Another strike hit a forward operating base near Tokmak, killing what Ukrainian military intelligence claims were over 60 Russian officers attending a planning session for upcoming operations. These weren't targets of opportunity. These were targets selected based on weeks of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and careful coordination with Western allies who provided real-time satellite data. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Western support after recent Republican opposition to additional Ukraine aid packages in Congress. Russia wanted to see whether Washington would look the other way if Moscow escalated during a moment of American political division. But instead, the opposite happened. Biden didn't equivocate. He authorized immediate intelligence sharing and real-time targeting data that was so precise, so detailed, that even Russia's Ministry of Defense noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but today Ukraine did, and they did it with American help. Former CIA analysts speaking with Reuters under anonymity described Russia's hospital strikes as probe warfare, a way to test red lines without triggering Article 5 NATO responses. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only devastating, they were coordinated so precisely that multiple targets across a 300-mile front were hit within a 90-minute window. That kind of synchronization matters because it shows operational maturity. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it, preparing for it, and countering it before Russia can consolidate gains. The speed of Ukraine's response also suggests something else. They were ready. They had these targets already identified. They had the munitions pre-positioned. They were waiting for Russia to give them a reason, and Russia did. This wasn't improvised. This was planned, authorized at the highest levels, and executed with a level of professionalism that demonstrated exactly how far Ukraine's military has evolved since the early days of the invasion. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian special forces carried out sabotage operations behind Russian lines in occupied Donetsk, forcing the evacuation of at least 2 battalion headquarters. Ukrainian naval drones targeted Russian vessels near Sevastopol that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours, sinking what preliminary reports suggest was a Rapusha-class landing ship. Ukrainian long-range artillery batteries operating near Robotyne reportedly destroyed 3 electronic warfare systems used by Russia to jam Ukrainian communications and GPS-guided munitions. This wasn't just a retaliatory strike. This wasn't just a show of force. This was strategic degradation. This was force multiplication. And force multiplication is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed 2022 offensive on Kyiv. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that degrades Russia's ability to hold, supply, or defend those gains. Today's strikes hit Russia where it hurts most, their logistical rear. Without fuel, ammunition, command infrastructure, Russian frontline units become isolated, vulnerable, and unable to conduct offensive operations. And that's exactly what Ukraine intended. Remember, Russia thought this war would be over in days. They thought Kyiv would fall within 72 hours. They thought Ukraine's government would collapse, its military would surrender, and the West would issue symbolic sanctions before moving on. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kyiv stands defiant. Ukraine's military grows stronger with every month of Western training and equipment, and Russia finds itself bogged down in a war of attrition it cannot win without total mobilization, a move that would threaten Putin's domestic political stability. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners want total war and full mobilization. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and a return to normalcy. Military commanders want more resources, more men, more time. And the Russian public wants victory without sacrifice, an impossibility in modern warfare. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an economy strained by sanctions, a military exhausted by sustained combat, and a diplomatic isolation that grows deeper with each escalation. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they're running out of options and running out of time. The hospital strikes weren't a sign of Russian strength. They were a sign of Russian desperation. The White House statement, now being circulated to all NATO member states, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to rewrite the rules of war with impunity. Senior administration officials said plainly that Russia's targeting of protected humanitarian sites was inconsistent with any definition of lawful military conduct. That is diplomatic language for this is a war crime and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. But today, the gloves came off. President Biden didn't just condemn the strikes. He authorized expanded intelligence sharing, approved accelerated delivery of advanced munitions, and reportedly told President Zelensky directly that Ukraine has America's full support in responding to this violation. That's not rhetoric, that's policy. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a somber, defiant speech tonight. He said, "Russia believes it can terrorize us into submission. They are wrong." He said, "Every attack on our hospitals, our schools, our children will be answered, not with revenge, but with justice." And he said, "We will not stop. We will not yield. We will not forgive those who wage war against humanity itself." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the hospital strikes, Belarus also increased troop deployments along its southern border with Ukraine. Russian naval assets in the Black Sea increased sortie frequency by 30%. Cyber attacks targeting Ukrainian government websites and critical infrastructure increased dramatically, with attribution pointing to Russian military intelligence units. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means they're preparing for escalation, not de-escalation. It means the ceasefire was never real. It was a tactical pause to reposition and rearm. Western intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a renewed offensive aimed at capturing the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts before the autumn rains make large-scale mechanized warfare impossible. Another is that Russia is attempting to force negotiations by demonstrating that it still possesses escalation dominance. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke Ukraine into actions that would fracture Western support and justify further Russian escalation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't target Russian cities. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure in retaliation. They didn't give Moscow any propaganda victories. They hit legitimate military targets with precision, proportionality, and devastating effectiveness. What we're watching now is a test of will. Russia wants to see if terror can achieve what military force has failed to accomplish. Ukraine wants to show that no amount of brutality will break their resolve. The United States wants to prevent this conflict from expanding into a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And Europe wants to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe that would send millions more refugees westward. All of these objectives are now colliding in real time on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. Tonight, we've heard from NATO military officials who are now closely monitoring Russian force movements near the contact line. They say Russia has not yet responded militarily to Ukraine strikes. They say Russian military communications indicate confusion and disarray at several targeted command posts. And they say Russia's decision to strike hospitals is likely part of a broader psychological warfare campaign intended to demoralize Ukrainian civilians before winter sets in. But Ukraine is not demoralized. In fact, Ukraine is energized. Their response today, swift, proportional, and strategically devastating, sent a message to Moscow that every escalation will be met with consequences. And it sent a message to Washington and Brussels that Ukraine remains a reliable, disciplined, and capable military partner worthy of continued support. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with these strikes. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It degraded Russia's offensive capability. It demonstrated continued Western support through intelligence and targeting assistance, and it showed that Ukraine will not be terrorized into surrender. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as the point where Russia learned that breaking agreements carries real military costs. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its Western backers have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is choosing his next move very carefully. It means his advisors are arguing behind closed doors about whether to escalate or step back. Because tonight Russia learned something they should have understood from the beginning. Ukraine will not break, the West will not abandon them, and every violation of international law will be answered with consequences, military, economic, and diplomatic. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's betrayal backfired, Ukraine's response succeeded. And the balance of power on the battlefield just shifted in ways Moscow did not anticipate. and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.